Hi, I'm Sabina Fu. Today on Ghosts of Mississauga, we'll explore the very beautiful and very haunted Glenerin Inn.
And some stories about some ghosts here at the inn. We joke a little bit that he's a part of the payroll, and but a very friendly presence.
Principally, he's seen in this room tending the fire and keeping the fire going, if you will.
Nestled here in the picturesque Credit Valley, the Glenerin Inn has lived many lives. The Glenerin Inn was built in 1927 by a Toronto lawyer named Watson Evans as a summer retreat. 2 years later, Watson expanded the property by adding a music room and tower to the building's west side. But sadly, Watson did not have many years to enjoy the stunning rural escape that he'd created for his family. He died shortly after its completion in 1932. The Glenerin Inn, I have to say, magnificent location. Now, in terms of the age of the building, it's not as old as some of the other locations that we've talked about, but what a history.
It represents a time in Mississauga's history when this was a retreat for wealthy Torontonians, and this is one of a few examples of those grand summer estates. This was a summer house. This was not a year-round residence, and this was a grand summer estate for a family that lived in Rosedale most of the year, and there were many built up and down the Credit River Valley, and this is one of few that survive.
Now, what do we know about Watson Evans?
He was a businessman. He was in mining amongst many other endeavors, as were others of his ilk in the time. He made his fortune. He was very wealthy, raised a small family in Rosedale. Many of their contemporaries were also building in what was then known as Toronto Township, in the rural areas of outside of Toronto. And they selected a spot high on a knoll overlooking a ravine and a valley to build their grand estate. And this estate was built between 1927 and the final edition in the 1930s. In every sense of the word, if you know the era of the Great Gatsby, for example, this would have been a grand place for entertainment and parties, and there's a smoking room and a large wing for not only their family, but also they would have had multiple servants traveling with them. So this was a grand home for a grand family. Some of their closest neighbors were Lieutenant Governor W.D. Ross, who had an estate nearby. So there were significant families that were also wealthy that lived in very close proximity.
The life of parties and luxury was short-lived. Watson passed away soon after Glenerin was completed.
And when he passed away in 1935, a very few years after this building was built, he chose to be buried nearby.
It's almost like his dream was fulfilled and then extinguished.
It's a sad element of the story, but what a legacy to leave behind.
After Watson's death, his widow appointed a couple named John and Avernell Sproul caretakers of the estate. Following the death of Watson Evans, the building, pardon the pun, took on a new life.
Mary Evans spent the last years of her life in a convalescent home herself after her husband passed away.
But by 1940, war drums were beating in Europe.
Hitler was not content with Austria. At Munich, he had said his theory of race and blood demanded the incorporation of all German-speaking peoples into the Reich.
And a religious order escaping the bombs would eventually find their way to the Glenerin Lodge.
The Evans family, Mary Evans, came forward and offered this house as a retreat for a girls' school from Hornby, England, known as St. Hilda's, and over 100 students from principally girls. There were 27 boys, but the rest were young girls, and their teachers came during the latter half of World War II and lived in this estate, attended nearby St. Peter's Church, and used this as their school and their home during the war years. They were known as as home children. Shortly thereafter, the property was sold to the Simpsons Company, and the Simpsons Company converted this home into a convalescent home for their employees. It was one of the first of its kind in Canada where they offered employees who were injured on the job or who had undergone surgery, that type of thing, a fully paid retreat in which they could come and have amenities in the country, live a relaxed lifestyle. They had full doctor services. It was a resort in a sense, and the pictures that survived from that era really highlighted as such. It operated as such into the early 60s, and at which point Simpsons was drawing a deficit, and this was one of the things that they did away with. And so this was sold, and it actually became home to a monastery, a Cistercian order. Purchased this, Basilian Fathers purchased this as a...
That's the actual name of it, a Basilian Fathers?
Well, Basilian Fathers was a Cistercian order from Toronto, and they purchased this building as a novitiate, which is where newly entered priests into their order would come for seminary training and for a retreat. And then in turn was purchased by a development company for the surrounding development. This was a sales office for a time. There was, in the former music room, was converted to a chapel for the Salel congregation, which was Mississauga's first Jewish congregation, met here, yes. And then in 1984 it was purchased by a company named Someplace Different, and they converted this into a country inn, and it still reflects that charm and that character of the earlier time period of the affluent 20s and 30s when the Evans were here. There was a clairvoyant who visited this property in the late 1990s, and they noted, it's a little note in a file, it's no more than a couple of sentences long, that says there is a spirit here, and he's male. People suggest that he may be a caretaker either employed by the Evans. The Evans did employ groundskeepers and caretakers for the property, but they also employed someone who lived in the gatehouse.
The benevolent entity seems to enjoy interacting with guests and has appeared as a full apparition in the front lobby. Could he be the ghost of Watson Evans still entertaining visitors? Or is one of the monks who once resided at Glenerin still seeking enlightenment?
People have seen him or heard stories of him, but principally he's seen in this room tending the fire and keeping the fire going, if you will.
Coming up on Ghosts of Mississauga, we tour the stunning Glenerin Inn, where a multitude of spirits reportedly are keeping the past alive.
He felt the presence, I guess more or less hug him and tuck him in before he was about to nod off.